Good morning, friends, allies, supporters, interested guests, friends of our allies. On behalf of Oxfam Canada, I'm going to be your moderator today. My name is Dana Stefov. Dana rhymes with iguana. I'm a women's rights policy specialist at Oxfam Canada, and I work on economic justice and sexual and reproductive rights. And I'm one of the co-authors of Oxfam's Feminist Scorecard 2022. So the idea today is that we share some of the content of that feminist scorecard with you, and we hear from some of our brilliant activists, friends and experts in some of the areas of the assessment that we make. We'll be recording the session, and then we'll be sharing it with those who registered after the webinar. And we will not have time for Q&A today or to address the chat, but if anybody has a comment, please feel free to share it. I'll take a look, and if there's a way to integrate it into the time between the panelists, I will. With that, I'm going to turn it over now to Deanna Sarosi. Deanna is Oxfam Canada's Director of Policy and Campaigns. She works on all of our policy files in various ways, brilliant mind, and she's advanced Oxfam Canada's government relations work and analysis on economic inequality, peace and security, aid, women's leadership, gender analysis and budgeting, etc. And actually the scorecard was Deanna's idea over 6 years ago, and it's now lived through 6 annual editions, thanks to that brilliant idea that Deanna had a while back. So Deanna, thank you for agreeing to provide opening remarks today and for sharing some highlights from our feminist scorecard this year. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dana, and welcome everyone. And thank you so much for joining our event. How does Canada stack up? It's, such a great tool, the feminist scorecard, to have to sort of do an assessment every year, about, are they walking the talk? Are they really, putting the words that they're putting out there really into action? So it's been, while it's a lot of work, it's also really a really great way to take stock of how far we've gotten and where we still need to go. So as Dana mentioned, I'm the Director of Policy and Campaigns at Oxfam Canada, and I'm based on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I use the pronouns she and her. So we're really excited to welcome our panelists today. I really have to say, over the years, it's really our allies who have made the scorecard so much stronger, so much better in terms of intersectional analysis, the level of expertise that is in there, and also, of course, when it comes to the recommendations to the government. So I really have to say that, this scorecard would definitely not be as strong as it is if it wasn't for our wonderful friends, allies, fellow schemers out there who are working day in and day out on advancing women's rights and gender equality. So as a global organization that fights inequality and poverty, we're really interested in sort of assessing what kind of progress is being made both globally, but also here at home. We're nowhere near a gender parity and gender equal society. There's lots of work that needs to be done here in Canada, especially when it comes to women from the most marginalized communities. So there is definitely room for improvement on all fronts. So the feminist scorecard sort of came into being quite a while ago now, when the Liberal government came into power. And it was really meant to be an exercise to see how a self-declared feminist government really stacks up to its promises. And so we've been publishing it every year. And this year, we're looking once again at 10 sort of issue areas: the care economy, representation and leadership, gender-based violence, poverty, rights of Indigenous women, climate change and extractives, global development, conflict and crisis, work and pay equity. So you can see it's really a very broad range of issues, but that's also intentional. As we know, women's rights is not just to women's issue. Everything is it touches on everything, right? And so really making that very clear. So how did they stack up this year? Well, there has definitely been some progress in terms of two sections in the scorecard, representation and care. We've seen huge wins over the last year in terms of the government moving towards a pan-Canadian healthcare system, and really investing in the care economy here at home and also around the world, which is really great considering the impact COVID has had on gender equality. But also there's lots of progress that remains on a variety of issues. Sort of what we, the findings that we've seen is there's a lot of sort of patchwork kind of approach to policies, rather than taking really a sort of systems change approach to things. Also, the intersectional approach really needs to be strengthened when it comes to government policies. There are still way too many people falling through the cracks, not being sort of addressed by some of the policy issues that are moving forward. So yeah, there's definitely lots of room for improvement, but I'm not going to bore you any further and really pass it over to the experts, the wonderful experts that we have here today. I'm so grateful for them to join us. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Dana.
Thanks so much, Deanna. I really appreciate it. Yeah, as Deanna said, every year that we put out the scorecard, we undertake a wide and deep process of consultation in all those policy areas. And so essentially what we're going to do is hear from some of those experts. The scorecard is authored by Oxfam, sometimes endorsed by our allies, but they're going to speak to the issues from their perspective. And because we'd like to go right to the source, to those people who have direct or lived experience or deep roots in their movements fighting for equality. So it's going to be a Q&A session between myself, I'm your moderator, and our 4 expert panelists. And before beginning with the first question, I'd just like to introduce you very briefly to our 4 panelists. We're joined today by Shalini Konanur, who is with the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario. She's also a senior lawyer with the clinic, and they work to improve access to justice for low-income racialized communities and break down intersecting barriers of racism and discrimination. Shalini's been practicing in the system since 2001 and has worked with low-income communities in both rural and urban settings, and in support of low-income racialized communities. She's got an active caseload and has also worked on campaigns around the intersections of poverty, race, gender identity, immigration status, faith-based discrimination, and gender-based violence. Lisa Pigeau is with Les Femmes Mishif, Otipemswak, I hope I said that correctly, and has devoted over 25 years working specifically with the Métis people in various capacities, on the front lines, in project coordination and in management. She's currently the Director of Intergovernment Relations and Gender-Based Violence Initiatives for the Métis Nation, for women of the Métis Nation, and her work is currently focused on murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQII+ people and ending gender-based violence. Aïcha Madi is with the Peace Track Initiative. She's a policy analyst with a specialty in security and gender issues. She promotes women's participation in peace and political processes in Yemen in her current work. Aïcha has lived and worked in the Middle East and North Africa with women victims of sexual and gender-based violence, as well as with victims of enforced disappearances and torture. She's interested in a number of topics: armed conflict, terrorism, radicalization, corruption, all with a gender lens, and has published widely in this field as well. She also undertakes joint advocacy with Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. And finally, last but definitely not least, Kimahli Powell is a longtime advocate for social justice with many years of experience working on a number of issues on youth rights, the African Caribbean Black community, people living and affected by HIV, as well as the LGBTQI+ community. He's worked in Malawi, in Jamaica, and sat on the board of ILGA World, which is a global LGBTQ network, He's also currently the chair of the Dignity Network Canada, which is Canada's coalition of civil society and movements working for Canadian leadership in support of LGBTQ rights around the world. And of course, as I didn't mention, his other hat is as the executive director of Rainbow Railroad. Rainbow Railroad has gone through transformational growth under Kimahli's leadership and has helped over 3,000 LGBTQI plus individuals find safety through emergency relocation and other forms of assistance. So without further ado, welcome. I'll cheer for you, and I'll clap on behalf of all of the attendees of today's webinar. And I'm going to open with a question that I'd like to address to all four of you. What we'd like to hear is a little bit about how your work intersects with some of the analysis presented in Oxfam Canada's 2022 Feminist Scorecard, a little bit about what you're advocating for and what the issue that you work on is. And I'll call on Shalini to start.
Thank you so much. So first I want to say thank you to all of my panelists for letting me share this time with you, and to Oxfam, and for the opportunity to contribute to the scorecard. Really, my work is around the intersections of multiple things: poverty, gender-based violence, racism, immigration status, and on. And so when I look at the scorecard, a few things come to mind for me in terms of the work that I'm currently doing. And so we know in anecdotal reporting that the incidence of gender-based violence has definitely increased over the pandemic. I have been doing that work for 20 plus years in South Asian communities. I have never seen it this bad, to be honest. It is at a level that is a shock to me and to my colleagues. And what we've been working on is the realization of something we knew before, but is crystallizing now, which is that we don't have a system that provides the linguistic and culturally competent services that our clients need. I spend hours looking for counselors to speak to my clients in the languages that they speak, and it's just not there. There is a void in terms of supporting these communities. And the other intersecting issue for many of the people I work with is either having precarious or no immigration status. And what that does in situations of violence is it'll put those people at even greater risk because they are concerned about loss of status. So we're doing a lot of advocacy on strengthening immigration protections. The other piece that we always knew about, and it comes from my work with an organization called Color of Poverty, Color of Change, is the continuing racialization of poverty. So we know from data that Indigenous and racialized communities in this country have disproportionately high rates of poverty. They are because of systemic racism and discrimination baked into the system across the board. And the reality is, coming out of the pandemic, we know those same communities face deepening rates of poverty. We've heard this term now being used, deep poverty. That deep poverty was always there for some of the communities I am talking about. That is not a new thing. And so I want to raise that because in many situations, I read about this as if it's a new phenomenon, but I think many of the people on this webinar and my panelists will feel it is not. And so we are working at the margin of trying to address the barriers. The reality is almost every kind of support in Canada is tied to your immigration status. If you don't have it, you don't get it. And what that means for me is I have never seen the number of clients I have seen living in their cars, making choices about whether they'll eat or their children will eat, making choices about which food bank I can go to today, and then can I go to another one, and trying to game a food bank system just to survive. And it's not good enough. This is a country where that's a choice, to keep people in that level of poverty. And the people we're keeping in that level of poverty are racialized and Indigenous communities. And so that's the other piece. And finally, really quickly, we're working on labor market outcomes and equity in employment. The reality is racialized women in this country are far behind where they should be. 67 cents on the dollar to a white man. That is inexcusable. And the reality of that is that we do not have good labor market outcomes. And that's not just getting a job. That's getting a good paying job, getting hired, getting promoted, getting retained, getting paid fairly, having conditions that are safe. all of those things around employment. And so the call from us for a long time has been to strengthen employment equity across the country and actually create employment legislation. That's my background as an employment and immigration lawyer, that gives workers the agency to assert their rights. Because you can have laws on the books, but when nobody enforces them, it doesn't matter.
Thank you, Shalini. Lisa, over to you.
So there's pardon me, several different ways that our work does intersect with the issues that I've spoken to in the scorecard. And I just want to commend the work on the scorecard. It sure is a succinct snapshot of the issues that we are facing. In terms of Métis women, and that's the only perspective I can bring to this table. I don't speak on behalf of all Indigenous women. I think that one of the ways that we intersect directly is with the women's leadership. That's been a challenge of ours ongoing for years, especially in terms of our political world, our internal political world, and as well with Canada in general. We're continually trying to introduce more opportunities for leadership, to begin to encourage our young women to develop skills in terms of leadership. In fact, we have a program that we've launched recently to develop those leadership skills, and where we see our young women going to be coming to take university level courses and developing those leadership skills. It certainly isn't enough, but it's a start. In terms of gender-based violence, I noted that what still needs to be done in that section, and there's, speaking about the implementation of the gender-based violence national action plan, I just want to make one comment on that. There's pillars within that national action plan on GBV, and there's the Indigenous pillar. What's been remiss in that whole national action plan on GBV is an Indigenous, or in our case, a Métis perspective throughout all of the different pillars and all the different threads throughout that national action plan. So it's like, here's the pillars, and let's talk about Indigenous women. So it's never been a comfortable place for us, this GBV national action plan. And for Madi, it doesn't speak to the reality faced by Métis women. And we've had, at best, minimal input on the action plan. So when it comes to the implementation of that action plan, what really needs to happen is that meaningful engagement, not just tick box engagement, that meaningful engagement on how these gender-based violence initiatives should roll out. I'm sorry, I'm probably speaking to the choir right now, but I find that whole national action plan process, and then we have our national action plan for MMIWG, it's often convoluted. And I think some perspectives are, unfortunately, you don't really need to be included on the national action plan on GBV, because you have your MMIWG, your Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls national action plan. And that is most unfortunate. So I would encourage you to perhaps, when you look at what needs to be done, is to be more inclusive in the implementation phase of the gender-based violence action plan. I'd also like to comment, and I know I'm running out of time, in the area of climate. This is an area that has impacted us for generations and generations and generations. It is only in the last year have we been granted any funding whatsoever to begin to speak of the effects of climate on our Métis women. And I think I've reached my 3 minutes.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I appreciate it. Kimahli, what can you speak to that touches on some of the work that you do and the Feminist Scorecard?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me, and thank you to my colleagues for your insights. I'm going to be mindful because I know some of my comments now will intersect with a bit of conversation later. But top of mind, I'm here representing a couple of spaces, as you mentioned, Donna. One as the volunteer chair of the Dignity Network, which represents communities across the country who are pushing Canada to do more to advance LGBTQI plus rights globally. And then, of course, as the executive director of Rainbow Rare, with that focus on refugee protection for people at risk. And then again, also want to just share my kudos on a really important a document and really a process to keep this government accountable on how, while acknowledging its advancements, also just really laying bare what work needs to be done. And, you know, specifically on LGBTQI plus rights, or queer rights, which I'm going to use the word interchangeably. You know, the government has signaled very clearly over the years that it wants to be a champion for LGBTQI plus rights internationally and domestically, and also on refugee rights. It has made piecemeal advancements, but a lot more needs to be done. And I think I'll say very succinctly that my reaction to the scorecard is the government needs to be more proactive and less reactive, which I think for me is kind of the threads of most of these issues here. At the Dignity Network, we have asked the government, laid out very clear recommendations on how it can advance LGBTQI rights plus rights, which intersects with its feminist foreign policy. We made a very clear ask that its international development assistance program not just lay out funds for LGBTQI plus rights. We give credit and acknowledge the government launching $30 billion of international development assistance for LGBTQI plus rights communities. But I'm not going to do the math in front of y'all, but you know it's a tiny, tiny percentage of its overall foreign policy envelope. And what we don't want is a segmentation of our communities. We want a full integration of sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics within Canada's feminist foreign policy package, if it's really going to be inclusive to LGBTQI plus rights. That's one example. In addition to that, you know, we are pushing for a more proactive refugee policy, a response to crises. All we have to do is look at the situation currently in Ukraine and not prior to Afghanistan to demonstrate that Canada needs to have more proactive tools to support not just LGBTQI plus persons, but people at risk internationally. So I'll stop there because I have a lot more to say, but 2 insights at the moment.
Thanks, Kimahli. That's great. Thanks for both of those interventions on behalf of Dignity and on behalf of the work you're doing with Rainbow Railroad. I'll pass it over to you, Aïcha, from the Peace Track Initiative. Thanks.
Yes, well, thanks so much to Oxfam for the invitation and for the important work with the Feminist Scorecard. I'd like first to acknowledge my gratitude for the unceded Indigenous lands on which I am located and work. You know, a bit like you mentioned in my introduction, I have been working with women victims of conflict since many years. And if there's something that always repeats itself, copy itself, is that women, they bear the consequences of the war. But also at the same time, they tend to be the one who address them. So I think this is a really important aspect, is that women are not passive victims of the war. Even if they are victims, they are also solution oriented, and they lead peace building work on the ground. And this is something that is underlined really well in the scorecard, is that, yeah, I mean, women, they are victims of a lot of discriminations, but they are also they do really important work for the society despite the areas. So unfortunately, a lot of times we see that the number of the victims of the Yemeni conflict rise, but also other armed conflicts in the world rise. And there's kind of this unwillingness or lack of work of the international community to recognize a bit and support local women's expertise, local women's work on the ground. And I think the scorecard really gives an opportunity to remind the world a bit that there's really a need to us as countries to do the work, but also us as countries to support the local women who do also great work on the ground and great necessary and important work on the ground. You know, a bit because of the place of the women in the social structures, because they are already mothers, teachers, caregiver, they have this proximity with children that men don't have, and so they kind of have this really strategic place to do prevention of radicalization, to prevent child enrollment in armed groups. So they already have this great power just because of their place in social structure, a bit in the same way, because they have the burden of doing the domestic work, of cooking food, of cleaning the house. They already kind of are pushed in this place, in this role, to be the one who, when there's climate change, when they are displaced in the country, they kind of have to have this role of being the one who are going to need strategies to find food, to find water for their families. So, I mean, women really, because of their place in society, they really are in kind of a strategic place to find solution, but also unfortunately in a place where they bear a lot of consequences of the war that are usually forgotten, a bit like with enforced disappearances. Like you mentioned, I worked with victims of enforced disappearances. So it's when people are abducted by security forces and then they kind of vanish. And with this crime, most victims who are abducted by security forces, of course, they're men. And so we tend to think that enforced disappearances, it's a crime that don't really have a gender dimension. But unfortunately, even in these crimes, women are the ones who are left with children, are the ones who are left to try to find work, try to feed the children, and who are alone in that. So with armed conflicts, even with crimes that we tend to think that it's only men who are touched, women are always bearing some gender dimension consequences. So this scorecard really does a great job of reminding us of that, and reminding us that women are not passive victims.
Thanks, Aïcha. That's great. I mean, some of the issues you're talking about are not great and they're hard to hear about, but thank you for bringing us those interventions. I'm going to ask now one question to each of our panelists, specifically about the issues that they work on, and we're going to start with Lisa. Lisa, hundreds of unmarked graves have been found at residential schools recently. And have reminded us that in 2021, the road, or 2022 rather, the road to reconciliation is just beginning. Violence against women and girls, Indigenous women and girls, limited access to drinking water on reserves, a high number of Indigenous children in foster care have received a lot of attention, but progress has been slow. What's the situation for women today? And what attempts are being made at addressing the genocide of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and gender-based violence?
A very difficult question. First of all, I want to pause a second and just honor each of the lives that were lost in those, and the realization of those graves, those unmarked graves, and the families who mourn their loss, and their life meant something, and I want to honor and acknowledge that before I go any further. And truly, we're just beginning to scrape the surface on that. There will be more discoveries on a monthly, daily. We almost don't even hear about it in the news anymore as more discoveries are made. And that's most unfortunate, because it does need to be to the fore. We do need to understand this history and the legacy of violence faced by us. Where are women at? I do believe that we are, for Métis women, we're in a different place than we were even 10 years ago, which is good to see. But unfortunately, the issue of missing and murdered Métis women, girls, and to us LGBTQI plus people hasn't stopped. So Métis women have been leading the file on behalf of the Métis Nation since pre-inquiry. And really, we all know that the inquiry lacked any meaningful distinctions-based recommendations, but it did recommend that there needed to be a distinctions-based approach to the National Action Plan and the implementation. But it took almost 15 months after the National Inquiry's report and our releasing of our report leaving Muskoka for the government to do anything. about implementation. And in fact, we're only able to contract this week to be able to begin the implementation phase. They're going to be doing a report card on the National Action Plan on June 3rd, the anniversary of the release of the inquiry report. And unfortunately, that's not going to be a very good report from our perspective. We're going to be brutally honest. Whether that's what comes out in the news or not, I highly doubt. It's the announcements for funding. There was really a lot of money that they, between the fall economic statement and the budget, that they tagged for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. However, a lot of that funding went to indirect services and support without a clear pathway to ending MMIWG. And I think there needs to be more specified approach and a specified direction of the dollars that they're getting, and really be honest about how much is maybe wrapped up in governmental secretariats and other ways to end missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And I think the biggest thing that's lacked throughout is that meaningful engagement. And really, it's not only about meaningful engagement, it's actually about co-development. And that co-development is a must. And it's not understood widely across different departments and different organizations. You know, there's still that perspective that people hold that they can just say, oh, we talked to them. They may have mentioned the subject to us, but did they really talk to us? Did they allow us the space and place to talk to our women? So it's one of the biggest goals for us is to gain that foundational data, because up to this point, we don't know how many missing and murdered Métis women there are. So we're just begging for that data. And then we can, you know, hopefully get some access to more funding to end the violence. We've done some commemoration work, which is very, very important. And I know I can't get deeply into it right now, but I'd encourage you to go to métiswomen.org and look up our project around commemoration of MMIWG. It is really a strength-based project to support families and those that are missing. I just, in the interest of naming and really recognizing MMIWG is still happening today. Not more than 2 weeks ago, a young woman, Tatiana Janvier, was 21 years old from Lac La Biche in Alberta, and her remains were discovered. To this day, the family do not know if their daughter was murdered. 2.5 weeks, I can't imagine as a mother having to deal with that. So have things changed? Absolutely not. And we need to continue to say those names and honor those lives, because it's going to take everyone, an entire whole society approach. And in fact, every single one of us to stop MMIWG. I think I'm out of time now.
Thanks, Lisa. I appreciate it. Those are difficult stories, but ever more important for us to continue to hold the government's feet to the fire on that. Kimahli, I mentioned the 2 hats that you wear at Rainbow Railroad and as chair of the Dignity Network Canada. Both organizations support LGBTIQ movements and human rights defenders from around the world, specifically folks that are targeted, threatened, persecuted because of their sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. What's a major trend that you're seeing currently globally? And what needs to happen in Canada's development assistance, foreign policy, and immigration policy to get us on the path towards queer liberation, which is it's a long way off, but let's focus on getting on the path towards it. What can you say about that?
Yeah, thanks. I want to appreciate the fact that we're covering a breadth of issues in this hour, but also kind of hold my previous colleagues' intervention and the really tough kind of issues laid out for Indigenous folks across the country, and just the urgent need for more aggressive action from the government, and to pivot to LGBTQI plus rights or LGBTQ plus rights. You know, I'd say the major trend here as it relates to this scorecard and Canada's foreign policy is that we can no longer just deny the clear intersection between these issues and the LGBTQ+ community, and which is why Canada needs a more thoughtful intersectional lens around this issue. I'll lay two examples. I know we're going to talk about Afghanistan shortly, but with both Afghanistan and the situation in Ukraine, we see directly how conflict, how conflict intersects with the vulnerabilities of the community and why Canada needs a more aggressive response. We're seeing right now in Ukraine the difficulty that trans women have on leaving the country because of the conscription and the demand that cisgender men between the ages of 18 and 16 leave the country. But we do not yet know how the government, how Canada is advocating and pushing for the needs of the right for all persons to claim asylum or to seek refugee status during that period. And I also just have to flag that while the proactive response to, or the reactive response to Ukraine is necessary, given the severity of the situation, we see the flaws with this approach. For example, Canada's policy in Ukraine does not include Ukraine refugees or nationals from other countries, which is a racist kind of approach to the policy, nor is that same kind of rigor and depth of policy afforded to folks in Afghanistan or in other crisis around the world. So what we don't want is policies, and you know, what I don't want to be is a cisgender Black man on a panel having to state that in Canada to the Canadian government, right? We don't want policies that pit communities against each other and signals and potentially signals that some communities are more priorities than others in any kind of circumstance. And for refugees specifically, where Rainbow Railroad really spends all of our time advocating for people who are displaced around the world, we now know that, you know, last year, like 2 years ago, we received 2,000 requests for help in 2020. In 2021, we jumped to 7,000 requests for help. We're going to surpass 10,000 this year. Is because we know that the intersection between conflict, climate, humanitarian disparity is all going to affect the LGBTQI plus community, whether you're a cisgender man, a trans woman, non-binary person, et cetera, which is why we've been advocating for really deeper inclusion within Canada's feminist foreign policy. It's not enough to just say LGBTQ2 plus, slap it on a policy document and say, okay, we're done. We have to show meaningful, clear indications that it's meant. And that means for the work of, I'll conclude with two things. It means specifically for refugees, we've been calling for a more proactive crisis response plan that allows civil society organizations like Rainbow Railroad to directly refer to the Canadian government LGBTQI plus persons at risk. In 2022, it's no longer really sufficient that the United Nations High Commission on Refugees is Canada's only referring partner robustly on these issues. And I'll just conclude by repeating what I said earlier, that as far as international development assistance, it means more than just providing a specific window of funding to LGBTQI plus rights. You know, the need is vast. 30 million is a start, but certainly cannot be the end of Canada's commitment.
Definitely a start, and we hadn't funded it at all before, but it's small. And I've been encouraging the community to put a bigger price tag on that intervention. Thanks, Kimahli. Aïcha, I wanted to ask you about the disproportionate stress that the pandemic has put on women in Canada and globally. I mean, at a global level, there's a food crisis in the Horn of Africa that's only received 3% of the appeal that it's asked for. Canada's promised to settle 40,000 Afghan refugees. The war in Yemen has intensified. I know you're working on Yemen explicitly. From your experience, why are women bearing the brunt of these crises, and what do we need to do to support women peace builders?
Yeah, great question. I think something that we tend to see, and especially during the COVID crisis, is some really disconnected expectation towards war zones, right? We were saying to people, during the pandemic, you need to wash your hands, but you know, people who live in refugee camps in different war zones, they don't even have water to drink, right? So telling them to wash their hands is a bit disconnected and a bit unrealistic. And this is something that we tend to always see. We tend to see some international aid that is not specifically adapted to context specificities. So this is really important, and this needs to change. And obviously, Lisa talked about climate change. Of course, in war zones, climate change, I mean, a bit like everywhere in the world, climate change is present. But in war zones where people are internally displaced and they go into refugee camps where there are a lot of people, a lot of pressure in a small zone that usually doesn't have the installation infrastructure to accommodate a lot of people, well, then the environmental crisis tend to intensify itself. And at the same time, you know, women, because of their place in societies, because of social structures, they have a really limited leverage to be able to find solution for climate change, right? Because they, you know, they are a bit like imprisoned in that mother role. So sometimes it's really, they don't have a lot of opportunity to actually build new infrastructures or come up with projects to fight for climate change. So I mean, because of a bit, yeah, like I said, social structures, hunger and climate change really becomes more intensified, especially with how women live the impacts of it. And something also that is a problem that we always see, like I said earlier, it's also something that I see in all the contexts, unfortunately. There's kind of this definition of violence where when we talk about war, about ceasefires, about peace talks, there's this definition about violence that only include arms, right? Or the violence like we think about it in a manly way. But also violence it also includes gender-based violence, right? And unfortunately, when we see ceasefires agreement, we see you know, articles that say you know, parties have to don't fire arms, don't do this, don't do that, but there's nothing about that. There's nothing to say that says that parties need to stop committing gender-based violence. So sometimes, unfortunately, with women that I have talked to, they were saying that, you know, before the conflict, during the conflict, and after the ceasefire, during the ceasefires, well, their situation didn't really improve because they were still target of rape. They were still target of many kinds of gender-based violence. So this is something that we really need to be mindful of when we do the international aid. And obviously something that I saw, especially in Yemen, like I said earlier, women tend to be oriented to solutions. Well, women in Yemen, they also use the pandemic crisis to have access to peace talks and meetings that it was difficult for them to access because it was difficult for them to travel, to go to these cities where the peace talks were happening. But with the pandemic, they also used Zoom, so women were more able to attend peace talks. So a bit like I said earlier, women, you know, they bear conflict, they bear consequences, but they also tend to always find solution.
Thanks, Aïcha. I appreciate hearing your stories. It's hard to imagine living in a camp and dealing with some of the impacts of war and conflict. Shalini, it's last but not least, you work with low-income South Asian men and women in Canada. You support them to defend their rights and access services, such as medical care, for example. What are you seeing in your community? I know you spoke to that a bit in your introduction. How has poverty impacted the incomes and COVID impacted the incomes, employment, workplace safety, education, et cetera, of racialized women and girls?
Thanks, Dana. I want to say before I start that I just want to wholeheartedly agree with what Lisa said, that we make a lot of statements and platitude on Indigenous women and the gender-based violence happening in First Nation, Métis, and Indigenous communities, and then we let it disappear off the radar, and that is not acceptable. and we all have an obligation to not let it disappear off the radar. And I believe that actually it's one of the most critical things that we should be discussing across the board. That being said, so in my own work at the South Asian Legal Clinic, the reality is I work with low-income clients, and poverty at its root is what is keeping women and children and families down, in particular racialized communities. What I want to make known to people is that our immigration policy is pushing a larger and larger sector of our population into precarious and no immigration status, and those are largely racialized people. So we have an underbelly of people who are second-class citizens in this country who do not have access to housing, who do not have access to income supports. And lots of times advocates talk about, well, they make incredible economic contributions, so they should be supported. The reality is that it goes far beyond that. They do make economic contributions, but they make contributions to the fabric of these communities. They are valued in the work they do. I see that in the work I do on the ground every day with my clients. And we are failing them. We are failing them, and the level of poverty they are living with in this country is, in my opinion, one of the deepest travesties that we have. We have poverty reduction strategies that do not address populations like this. And so my view is we have a very deeply flawed poverty reduction strategy. We have barriers in place that do not allow women and children to be included and supported in the way they need to be. And we can go across the board in terms of employment, housing, income supports, labor market outcomes on every level, every community that all of us have talked about. The data is telling us that it's failing. And what is even more interesting is Canada is notorious for not collecting disaggregated data and race-based data. We are intentionally hiding the stories of these communities. We need to do better. I want to end by telling you that in the past 2 weeks, I am working with a group of 30 women who are non-status, who are terrified of being removed from this country, and they are working in Ontario for $3 an hour. And that is not a unique story across this country. And that is a shame on all of us that we would allow that to happen. And we need to talk about, when we talk about accessibility, we really need to think about, what does that mean? COVID has taught us to triage. We learned to triage getting the shots in the arms of our most vulnerable community members. And so when we have these conversations about breaking glass ceilings, I always say that's fine and great. Maybe for me, I'm up here, right? My clients are down there sweeping up the glass that I broke, and they're not supported. And so we need to start talking about a flip in terms of who we're triaging and who the priorities are. Thank you.
Thanks, Shalini. No one should be illegal. No one is illegal. I'll steal that tagline from one of those great grassroots organizations working on some of these issues. Thanks for speaking your truth on that. So to close, and we won't be closing right away, we'll be hearing from all 4 of our experts, allies, friends, let's call them friends, one by one. Specifically, I want you to try to capture, and in a bit of a nutshell, what you think still needs to be done. I mean, the government has called itself unabashedly feminist. There's been a lot of new investments and initiatives, and that we've been grateful for. Like there's a new LGBTQ strategy. There's new funding. The gender-based violence funding has increased. They responded to that in the context of COVID. They've been slow on some other issues. They've been slow on tax reform. They've been slow on some of the key issues in the unpaid care world, for example. But looking back over the past year, where did they get things right? Where did they miss the mark? And within your area of expertise, what can and should Canada be doing? How do we galvanize Canadian leadership in the area of your expertise? And how do we hold them accountable for that? Let's start with Kimahli. 2 to 3 minutes, please.
Yeah, for time's sake, I'm gonna strive for brevity here. First, Shalini, I will stick with the sweeping the floor of the glass ceiling metaphor for a while. That was really powerful, and thank you for that. And I think it's just a reminder of you know, we can't leave others behind. And the other thing about your intervention that is tied to my comments here is, you know, COVID, the response to COVID, there's so many examples of how innovative and powerful our collective governments can be when we choose to. And so my response around, I've already talked about what Canada needs to do with the scorecard. So be very specific about opportunities forward, because we don't want to talk an echo chamber. And if anyone from the government is listening, here's what you can do, right? Like the LGBTQI plus plan has not yet been published. And at this moment, civil society has no idea what's going to be in it. That's a problem. You have an opportunity now to consult with civil society to make sure it's inclusive, that it's intersectional, that includes a clear commitment to international development, and that it clearly ties to Canada's feminist foreign policy. That you can do right now before it's published and it has inaccurate data and you're frankly piss everybody off. That's one. The second thing is that a proactive crisis response plan to accept LGBT plus refugees, to increase international development assistance, that liaison with civil society is another important thing that you can do right now. I'll leave it at those two things. You know, the reality here is that we have a government that's in its second minority. I personally believe that, you know, in lieu of proportional representation of governments, that we need to expect either minority governments or collaborative governments for the foreseeable future. So now is a really important opportunity for Canada to learn some valuable lessons and part of our civil society right now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kimahli. Aïcha, what message do you have for the Canadian government moving forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, we have a Women, Peace and Security Ambassador, so this is groundbreaking and great, but more needs to be done. I think, first of all, I think the government should send as strong and uniform message to condemn violence and call for ceasefires. We have seen Trudeau and Minister of Foreign Affairs Jolie condemn a lot Russia in their public statements in the past few weeks, but we unfortunately haven't seen as much statements about other armed conflicts that are happening. And about, of course, about Ukraine, more needs to be done and more should be done and can be done, but also more can be done and should be done about other victims of war that are happening in the world. So this is my main message and main demand for the government of Canada. And of course, we've heard a lot about the Afghan refugee crisis. We have seen really great action by the government of Canada, but also in practice, at the moment, there are a lot of Afghan refugees who were promised to come to Canada and who are trapped in Mexico and who have been trapped in Mexico for the past 8 months. So this needs to be changed. You know, what is being said is that there's immigration delays, but this really needs to, unfortunately, needs to speed up and change.
Thank you, Aïcha. Shalini.
Really quickly, regularize the status of all precarious and non-status people in this country. That would go a long way towards the women and children of this country. Remove all barriers in federal legislation that have immigration eligibility requirements, including and most importantly, that we magically are now able to provide healthcare coverage to everyone during COVID. Keep it alive. Don't let us go backwards. And finally, the thing that I hear the most from my clients is they want to work. They want to have good lives here. We need employment equity. We need a way to drop the barriers in our own labor force so people deserve to have those good jobs. People deserve that. And so the only way that we can do it at this point is employment equity. The other piece about what is good is in COVID, for the first time ever, they started collecting disaggregated race-based data on unemployment. So keep it up and now expand it. We want to see it across the board and not just race-based data. We want to see gender identity data. We want to see it all so that we can know who is falling behind and we can say with clarity as advocates what needs to happen. And we don't have to talk anecdotally just about my client on this day and my client on that day.
Thanks, Shalini. Lisa, I give you the final word. I know you don't speak on behalf of all Indigenous women, but from your perspective, what can Canada do to support the path to reconciliation?
So from the Métis women's perspective, there's some bright points in what they've done. I would like to acknowledge that. Is it not enough, or is it not addressing the full range of challenges that we face? I would love nothing more than to never have to come back and speak about the requirement of having a scorecard. It's just ridiculous that we have to, present this to the government to say, well, this is kind of okay or not okay, or you really missed the mark. There shouldn't be any difference between me and the challenges I face and the challenges non-Indigenous man would face. We have to find that equal ground. I think we have to change the narrative. The government can put out as many programs, projects, funding, but until the public views us as equal partners in Canada and changes the narrative and changes the stigma that follows us, changes that prejudice that they have against us, changes that really, really ingrained racism that's been so prevalent for generations, it doesn't matter how much money is going to be coming tumbling down, because we're not changing things on the ground. And I think in some of these issues, when they involve us as Métis women in these issues and whatnot, it's truly not our issue. It's the issue of the rest of the non-marginalized population. So let's focus the work on them. Let's focus the work and ask them to do the work to change that narrative. I'm going to leave it at that today. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. Wow, what powerful interventions. I'm so honored to have been part of the conversation, to have asked you some of these hard questions and to hear some of your solutions for change. We're also extremely happy that we've been able to give voice to some of the issues that you're working on, and hopefully this helps advance some of your issues as well. I genuinely believe that we're stronger together, and as somebody said earlier, we can't rob Peter to pay Paul. We need to be working together, I think, across the movements to be able to pay attention to some of the issues that you've raised and to sort of triage the most vulnerable and the most excluded from our societies. And as you've said, and as we've said, we've made progress in many areas. I think that we can all keep working together. I think that we need to keep bringing the voices of people that are demanding justice to the decision-making table and to keep Canada accountable to that feminist progress. We need to keep working with allies, both inside and outside of government. And as you guys said, we need to co-create with Indigenous women. We need to call for ceasefires in all crises, not just in Ukraine. We need to regularize the status of those that don't have it. We need employment equity. We need to drop barriers in the labor force. We need a robust LGBTI, the government puts the 2 at the back, I think, or we need a robust LGBTQ2S action plan, and we need to know what's in it, and that it comes with the funding necessary to support queer communities in Canada. We need to put ourselves out of business, and we need to make sure that folks like the Métis women, for example, are not facing greater challenges than others in society, and change the way we see things, I think, is the last message that I'll leave you with. Culture change needs to happen. We need to work with the public to change those norms, those attitudes, those behaviors that keep people excluded in our society. So congratulations to the work that you've done and the progress that you've made in the areas of your expertise. We congratulate the Canadian government for addressing a lot of these issues and starting to make change, but there's still work to be done, and we continue to demand progress. And with that, we're going to end it. Thank you all very much for this discussion, and thank you to all of our attendees. We have recorded it. You'll be receiving a copy of the recording. And finally, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at Oxfam Canada, and we can either put you in touch with some of our panelists or follow up on some of the issues that interest you. Thanks so much, everyone. It's funny not to see you, but we'll close there. Take good care.
Bye.